You can be skeptical about everything except your own skepticism. When you become skeptical about that, then interesting things happen.
Malcolm is like the platonic ideal of a re-enchanting guest.
He is Mr. Re-Enchanting.
When I rejected my faith, I thought everything was reducible to the firing of synapses. But when I came out, I knew it was more than brain chemistry.
Poetry had presumably some influence on your own coming back to faith then.
Poetry was as much an instrument for finding out what's really there as the polished lens of a telescope. Now, at the time I was writing this, I literally thought to myself, boy, am I going to be in trouble with Martin Shaw.
You do not want to be in trouble with Martin Shaw.
When I actually read those poems, I noticed that Coleridge was not saying, we are going to provide you with a sweet comfort. What he was trying to do is to awaken the mind's attention.
Where did this all begin for you though? Hello and welcome back to another episode of Re-Enchanting from Seen and Unseen. I'm Justin Briley.
And I'm Belle Tyndall-Riley.
And this is
And
the
I'm
show.
Malcolm
And we've got Malcolm Guite, who has
Sorry.
introduced himself. It's fine, Malcolm. You're allowed to introduce yourself. That's
Yes,
no
you
problem.
are. Yeah.
We like to have a little kind of build up to our guests before.
Oh, well, you can do that too if you like.
I love the fact you just sort of felt comfortable enough to just sort of introduce yourself off the bat. Anyway, we are the team from Re-Enchanting. Malcolm Guite is our wonderful guest today as we seek to re-enchant all things both secular and religious and ask, how do we re-enchant a culture that has often become very materialistic, post-Christian in its outlook? And we were just saying before we got recording, Belle, Malcolm is like the platonic ideal of a re-enchanting guest for
I
us
think
today,
so.
isn't
He is Mr. Re-Enchanting. I know. We said, this was only a matter of time. It was only a matter
Absolutely.
of time until you went, okay, Malcolm, I'm going to give you your full, nice, big bio and introduction. Are you the type of person who enjoys this or hates it?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm sometimes raise my eyebrows. I had a great one once. One time, Jeremy Baby was introducing me at Duke, and his script said he lectures widely in the USA and Europe or whatever it was. And he actually read, he lectures wildly in the
That's sort of true as well.
Yeah. Okay, right. Let's see how we do. So, Malcolm Guite is a beloved poet, storyteller, singer, songwriter, wild lecturer, and and author of so many beautiful pieces of work, including, Malcolm, two of my all-time favourite books, Faith, Hope and Poetry, and then kind of like its companion piece, would you call it that? Lifting the Veil, Imagination in the Kingdom of God. They are two books that I think I've read most in my life.
Yeah, Lifting the Veil was a kind of... I'd been very struck how two writers I admire, Michael Ward and Diana Glyer, having both written, as it were, proper academic monographs, Ward's Planet Narnia and her, The Company They Keep About the Inklings. They then both wrote shorter, more accessible, more popular books, taking those ideas and opening them out, and perhaps, in my case, directing them particularly to artists and creative people. Yeah. So that's kind of... he wrote the Narnia Code and then she wrote Bandersnatch. So this is my equivalent of taking some of the things I'd argued at in a more thoroughly bristling with footnotes kind of way.
Yes.
More accessible. That was what...
Oh, gosh, I recommend it heartily. I adore it. And of course, your latest offering, mighty offering, which is Galahad and the Grail. I'll hold it up for those of you on YouTube. It's a beautiful thing to behold. Galahad and the Grail, which is Merlin's Owl, Volume 1. One of 4, I think is going to be.
Yes, I have got my work cut out.
Big old offering. And so today, as Justin has already mentioned, we get the joy of talking with Malcolm about ancient stories, about poetry, about the imagination, and about what it means to take up the tale. Welcome to Re-Enchanting, Malcolm.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. As you say, it was just a matter of time.
Yeah.
Well, we always begin the same way with every guest, Malcolm, here on the show, and that is to simply ask, what are you currently reading? I can imagine, like many, you have a few books on the go at a time, but what are those books currently, and could you tell us about them?
Well, the one I'm reading at the moment and it's a fairly new book, well, I'm reading several new books. One is Richard Holmes's really interesting book on the kind of first half of Tennyson's life, and it's called The Boundless Deep. And it's a particularly looking at Tennyson and science and Tennyson's responses to that at a deep level, but also at Tennyson's heights and depths. And I mean, Holmes is he is the great romantic biographer. I mean, his 2-volume book on Coleridge really essential. Though having said that, I mean, I actually, part of my own sort of bigger book on Coleridge, Mariner, was partly a response to the fact that I felt, like a lot of contemporary more secular authors, that he was to some degree airbrushing out some of the specifically Christian and Trinitarian resonance of Coleridge. So I was kind of trying to redress a balance, but that is not to say that I don't deeply admire him. He's a very fine writer, and this is a kind of follow through of his Age of Wonder. So he's trying to remind us that the beginnings of the sciences as we have them now were very much interwoven with poetry and the arts and the imagination. I mean, obviously Humphrey Davies, the father of modern chemistry, is a great friend of Coleridge's. So it says this book is partly about Tennyson's scientific reading, and that's instructive. I mean, Tennyson's a very important poet to me, but the question, how does a poet read science, is not a million miles away from the disenchantment and re-enchantment questions we might want to be asking ourselves. So I'm reading that. And I'm also reading Robert Macfarlane's astonishing book, Is a River Alive?
Yes.
I know Robert Little, and I've followed his work, and this strikes me as, again, breaking new territory. And it's, in fact, again, touching on the way we need to change our whole framing of what rivers and mountains and so on are, which, again, is not a million miles away from this. In fact, I sent, when I was in the middle of reading The River Alive, I sent him a section of the Galahad and the Grail thing, where I have the story of Galahad and the Naiad, and we deal with this entire question of of how rivers get killed and how they get revived and so on. So those are the 2 modern books I'm reading.
Well, and you've got some of them stacked up behind you, Malcolm. And
Yeah.
indeed, I was having a little look at your YouTube channel before we came on, and you've got this lovely, charming set of videos, which seem to be incredibly popular, where someone just knocks at the door of your study, comes in, and you greet them in as though they're coming into a sort of little hobbit hole or something.
Yeah.
And you sort of just wax lyrical on a book you're
on whatever it
reading
is.
or something.
That series is called A Spell in the Library, and I was very much playing on the word spell. I mean, a spell, a little amount of time, but also a
Yes.
spell.
Yeah.
One of the first things I ever did on that was to read the bit in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where Lucy reads a spell for the refreshment of the spirit. And that's what I hope those YouTubes are. I started that. It's extraordinary. I mean, I started that in lockdown, almost the first day of lockdown. I was still chaplain at Girton in Cambridge, but I couldn't get in, to college. Some students were stuck in college, some were stuck at home. We were all isolated. And I suddenly, had to reinvent myself as cyber chaplain. And I put all those services, online and that kind of thing. But the real core of my chaplaincy was about presence. It was about amiable, welcoming, non-judgmental presence, openness to a conversation that might deepen at some point. So the whole way was, I was always no office hours, just available. Somebody would knock on the door, and I would inevitably say, "Oh, come in," and it might well chance that I, might pull a book off the shelf and read something if it seemed appropriate. So I thought, how do I do that now? And I sort of taught myself one morning how to load up a thing to YouTube. And my wife very kindly agreed to be the proxy visitor and hold the iPhone. And she comes up and knocks on the door, and she stands in for anyone who wants to come and visit me. And I thought I would be doing this. We all thought lockdown wasn't. I thought I'd be doing this for a couple of months, for a couple of dozen students. But it began to grow like Topsy, as they say.
Yeah.
He was meeting a need. And I think so much online stuff had become toxic and difficult for people that I'd created, as it were, a little haven. And when lockdown came to an end, lots of people wrote to me and said, "Don't stop, don't stop. We still need this." So then, it suddenly started having, hundreds of thousands of views. So I thought, well, I may as well carry on.
It is. It's fascinating, and if I'm honest, if you don't mind me saying this, Malcolm, you do look the part. You look like you've sort of dropped out of some Arthurian legend yourself, and so I think it kind of it creates this beautiful scene that
Yeah.
people just find it enchanting and magical.
I alternate when people say the kind of so sort of somewhere between a wizard and Father Christmas.
Yeah. And that's a delightful place to be. Somewhere between one of those. Is there something, and I think I know the answer to this, Markham, but I want to hear you talk about it anyway. Are there things that you feel like you've been reading your whole life and you will be reading for your whole life? You just can't get enough, can't put it down.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think without question, Narnia. I had those read to me. Then I was old enough to read them myself. I read them and reread them. I reread them when I was courting Maggie, my wife. In the early 80s. An evening together in public, I would actually, at her request, I read her all the Chronicles of Narnia because I love reading aloud.
Oh my goodness! Right, dating tips from Malcolm Guite.
And I was going through the sort of various points of crisis and turn and re-evaluation, which led to my return to Christian faith as an adult, as a student in my final year at Cambridge. The summer before all that happened, I thought I must read the Gospels properly, and and then I just thought, I feel like Narnia again. So I reread those books, and again, there was so much more. I mean, that was very funny. The circumstance, desperate trying to make money as a student. This was the summer of I guess 79, and I got a job in an ice cream factory, in a Walls ice cream factory, packing the ice creams into crates. But the union rules were that you could only have 20 minutes in this deep freeze. You had packing,
Sure.
and then you'd have 20 minutes off in this kind of mizzen hut that they had, where you could have your coffee or whatever. There were no lunch breaks or after. It was just 20 minutes on, 20 minutes off. So I reread Narnia and the Gospels and the Dialogues of Plato, basically 20 minutes of it, then 20 minutes down in the deep freeze reflecting on it in this completely mechanical job of piling, getting the ice cream boxes as they came down the
Wow.
conveyor belt and putting them on pallets. And it was it was amazing. There was a rule that you couldn't take any ice creams out of the factory, but that if a box fell and was damaged, then the workers could enjoy the ice creams in the mizzen hut. It's extraordinary how often boxes fell.
Yes. Yeah, just elbows nudging them.
I mean, then the Lord of the Rings. I mean, so it's
Okay.
not unsurprising, So those the Narnia world and the Middle Earth world, I've visited and revisited and have they themselves have visited and revisited me and formed my imagination. So, but the other thing you won't be surprised to hear is the particular constellation of poets that make me who I am and make me want to write poetry. So the one that got me started and saying, oh, this is what I want to do, it's what I want to sound like, was Keats. And then I keep going back to Keats. I mean, I know a lot of Keats by heart, but I've got lovely old editions. It's a pleasure to turn the thick pages and see the beautiful print. And those are kind of spells or incantations. The 5 great odes of Keats, particularly the Ode to a Nightingale, I will go back to again and again. Coleridge and Wordsworth, but mainly Coleridge, both poetry and prose. And then, of course, I found my way, going back in time, as it were, I then found my way to the metaphysicals and Donne and Herbert. Herbert, I think, now more in my life than Donne, but Donne was very important to me, as a young. But even so, I mean, just to give you an example, when lockdown came, and obviously in the lead up to it, we were hearing all about this coronavirus. And it was by sheer, I think, literally just because the word corona was in the air, I just reread Donne's beautiful sequence of 7 sonnets addressed to Christ called La Corona. I mean, it's called La Corona because corona, of course, means crown. And a corona is a way of writing a poetry sequence where the last line of the first poem is the first line of the second poem and so on until the final line of the final poem is the first line of the first poem. So it is a coronet. And that inspired me, a slightly crazy thing. I mean, Donne does it with 7 sonnets. Going through from the Annunciation to the Ascension, all addressed to Christ. His opening and closing line are addressed, deign at my hands this crown of prayer and praise. I had the crazy idea, because we all went slightly crazy during lockdown, that I could do that, but instead of doing 7 14-line poems, I could do 150 15-line poems responding to each of the psalms, which I did, but it was kind of slightly. So
Wow.
these guys, like Donne and Herbert, I mean, I wrote a whole sequence of sonnets responding to just one sonnet by Herbert. So these poets have remained not only constant companions, but their poetry is not only generous, I think, but it is generative. It actually
Yes.
stimulates the
This
right.
is the beauty, in a sense, of poetry literature. It does feel like you can be in dialogue with people who are obviously
Oh,
long
it's a
gone.
long conversation. Actually, I mean, I always thought of it as a kind of conversation. And even though poets are in the past, you may not read them in their chronological order. And they all talk to each other in my mind, and they talk to me.
Yeah.
Now, the person who put that even more beautifully than conversation is George MacDonald, who is also one of the kind of pioneers of literary criticism and close reading. He wrote an astonishing book in the late 19th century called England's Antiphon, in which he imagined, particularly the Christian poets of the English tradition. He said, we have an auricular chapel, a sort of chapel of the ear, a chapel in our mind, and the poets come into it, and on either side, they sing their poems antiphonally to one another, and we hear the kind of cross sound of their music. It's a beautiful conception of how poetry works.
It's beautiful. I just wanted to ask, we will get to your own poetry and,
Oh,
this
right,
wonderful
right.
new poem as well in a moment. But fascinating to hear that at some level, poetry, literature had presumably some influence on your own coming back to faith then.
It
I
did,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
I remember when we interviewed some seasons ago Holly Aldway, she described a little bit of her own experience here. I'm sure you know Holly, Malcolm.
Yes, yeah, I know her well.
And there's this wonderful moment when she talks about it was actually the moment when she read those words by Donne, "Batter my heart, three
That
person God."
three-person God.
She said she felt like an electric charge went through her, and it was the beginning of her discovering the Christian, obviously, underpinnings of so many of her favorite works of poetry, and ultimately the truth behind that. I mean, did you go on any similar journey as you encountered this beauty?
It was a kind of journey in stage. It wasn't quite like Holly's sudden shock. It was a series of moments.
Mm.
I love the fact that when that was happening to Holly, she was a very good fencer at that time, and she was in the middle of a fencing tournament. And there's some sort of metaphor of kind of fencing with God. Anyway, so to give it, I'm going to return to Keats' moment. So yes, there were certain moments where certain writers pierced me and reordered what I was doing, though God also did that in his own way. So very briefly, when I rejected my faith, which I did in my sort of stormy teenage years, I was stuck in a rather dysfunctional boarding house. I was homesick. I was questioning everything, and my faith had been childlike, but also to some degree childish. Anyway, I was given at this school the whole modern Enlightenment, imminent friend counter narrative to the narrative of faith that I'd been brought up with, and it was terrible. When I look at it, it was absolutely very crude, but I was impressed by it at the time, not least because the narrative was that just as you read fairy tales as a child, but then you forget about Father Christmas. So religion was to do with the childhood of mankind, and that now we've all read Kant and we've grown up and we dare to know and not to believe, and we test everything, and we should approach things with systematic skepticism. Except I noticed eventually that you can be skeptical about everything except your own skepticism. When you become skeptical about that, then interesting things happen. So I bought this whole thing, and one of the things we didn't have Dawkins then. They had the Selfish Gene or the God Delusion hadn't come out yet, but the equivalent of that back in the day was a guy called B.F. Skinner, who was a behaviorist and had basically took almost an action and reaction model to human behavior. If there is a consciousness inside, it's an epiphenomenon accidentally thrown up by the random concatenation of atoms. So everything was reduced to a material plane. Everything was explicable in terms of Newtonian action and reaction, and including so-called independent thought. And in the case of the brain, it was the firing of synapses, and it was, electrochemical serotonin, and all of that, So I had this very reductive model, and I think I did it partly kind of to take revenge on my own finer feelings, and repress quite a lot that was going on intuitively in me. And I really believed it, and I therefore believed that, any sense of meaning is either a delusion or it has to be self-generated and have its own authenticity. So I have to say, I was a horribly precocious teenager, and I was reading Jean-Paul Sartre under the bedclothes, as a 14, 15-year-old, and saying, well, I shall dare to stand on the brink of the absurd. And, my great text was Waiting for Godot, and so fine. And then I was taken by an aunt of mine in a half-term holiday to Keats's house. And I didn't really know who Keats was, but I got a sense of it, on Hampstead Heath. And my aunt was going meticulously through every single display case and, taking notes. I was bored. So the Ode to a Nightingale was up on the wall of the room where the windows, the casements opened into the garden where the tree is that the nightingale sang, that magical spring of 1819. And having nothing better to do, I read the poem. And the opening verse, you may remember, I mean, it's got a wonderfully kind of it starts, my heart aches and a drowsy numbness pains my sense, as though of hemlock I had drunk or emptied some dull opiate to the drains 1 minute past and Lethe woods had sunk. So I'm going like ache, dull, drains, drunk, you had me on ache. So I was reading this and just let my moodiness and the moodiness of that opening, slightly self-obsessed, depressed teenager. Great. But then, as you know, there's this sudden, complete transformation. He doesn't even tell you that he's heard the bird. Just after the word sunk, I mean, if it had been Philip Larkin, he would have ended on the word sunk, but he was Keats. So you may remember the next verse goes, "'Tis not through envy of thy happy lot, but being too happy in thine happiness, that thou, light-winged dryad of the trees, in some melodious plot of beech and green and shadows numberless, singest of summer in a full-throated ease." And I'm going like, what was that? It's unbelievable. And it's a richly sensual poem, and he goes out, I cannot tell what flowers at my feet. And it gets more and more intense and beautiful until you get to this. Then he introduces out of nowhere the biblical figure of Ruth. When he imagines Ruth hearing a nightingale, just as he's hearing the nightingale. And it's when she stood sick for home, she stood in tears amidst the alien corn, and by that time, I mean, I got into those. And then right sort of at the back of the poem, there are these windows opening on something utterly transcendent. So, as he says, he thinks the song of the nightingale had charmed magic casements opening on perilous seas in fairy lands forlorn. And it was a moment where beauty suddenly opens onto something beyond the material, something utterly transcendent. The whole question of mortality runs through the poem. But thou wast not born for death, immortal bird, no hungry. So it's this moment of it. And I stood there amazed. And then my aunt was still going meticulously around the cases. And I just read the poem again and again and again until I almost knew it by heart. And I murmured it. It was like, indeed. And when I walked out of that house, when I'd walked in, I thought everything was reducible to the firing of synapses and, life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, But when I came out, I knew that whatever else had happened, it was more than brain chemistry. I'm not saying it wasn't brain chemistry, but the brain chemistry could only be one stratum of the whole thing.
Yeah.
And the whole thing could not be adequately accounted for. So what that did is it opened me up to the dimension of the spiritual. And it took some years. Keats was not a Christian poet, and Nightingale is not a Christian poem, notwithstanding the strange appearance of Ruth. But I was no longer a doctrinaire atheist. I was now open to something. Then the other things came, and one of the things that came pretty early, I was studying medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge, and we were supposed to read, some theology as a background, and I read Augustine's Confessions, which completely blew me away. So
Yeah,
the
that'll do
line
it.
that pierces me a bit like to batter my heart was not the batter my heart, but rather the loving invitation. When he says, late, late have I loved you, beauty, always ancient, always new. I thought, oh my God, you know, now I know that there may be a beauty from which the beauty of the Ode to the Nightingale came. And then, you know, later, finally dropped. Back in those days, the university was not ashamed to say to people that if you want to read literature, you really need to know the grounding theological text. So the first two books on the reading list I was sent for the year before I went up to university were the authorized version of the Bible and the Book of Common Prayer.
Oh, wow.
I was reading the Psalms in the Book of Common Prayer, Coverdale's translation of the Psalms, and when I was reading Psalm 145 in the summer of 79, which is the late after I'd done the you know, the Narnia readings and things, you know, the thing about the Lord is near to all who call upon him, and the Lord upholdeth all such as fall. That all kind of gathered me up, and eventually, you know, the whole thing came together, and I returned to faith. But in a strange way, I still kind of owe the very beginning of it to Keats. By that time, I had started to read Donne and Herbert. And again, although I loved Donne, and I certainly love that batter my heart, I actually, it was the Herbert of love bade me welcome, but my soul drew back. And the other person who was right on the cusp of it, the book came out in 78. And so it was contemporary poetry, and it was Geoffrey Hill's book, Tenebrae. And the final sonnet in the sequence Lacrimae, or Tears, really, really, just like, it was like he had said what my heart was constantly saying and was afraid of hearing itself saying. And of course, the opening question of that great poem is, what is there in my heart that you should sue so fiercely for its love? What kind of care brings you as though a stranger to my door, through the long night and in the icy dew, seeking the heart that will not harbour you, that keeps itself religiously secure? You know, and that's after 6 sonnets of saying to Jesus, this doesn't work. So that's very different, isn't it? That's not just my quest, that's Christ's quest.
Yeah.
So those,
Wonderful.
yeah, sorry, long answer to a short question, Belle, but
Oh no, a beautiful answer. A truly beautiful answer, and leads us on. If we I promise, dear listeners, we're gonna get onto Galahad and the Grail imminently. But I just don't want to pass up the opportunity, seeing as you are Mr. Re-Enchanting. I'd love to get your thoughts on what that word even means, what enchantment even means to you, disenchantment, and then re-enchantment, because it's not. If we would be remiss to imply to our listeners, I think, that we think that the world is a disenchanted place.
yeah, exactly. No, this is, yeah. So if I can just sort of,
Please,
I'll
over to
say
you.
the first thing first, then I'll turn it back to it. So basically, I totally understand why people want to speak of re-enchantment. I think it's a response to a disenchanted approach to the world, a false
Yes.
approach, I think, which makes it disenchanted. And
Yeah.
that thing, you know, being, to borrow Charles Taylor's phrase, you know, that trapped in the imminent frame, which is exactly where I was in my
Yeah.
teenage years, and which Keats set me free from. Now, I don't think my problem with the term re-enchantment is that, first of all, I don't think the world is actually unenchanted. I think we are the ones who are failing to see what it is. So what I'm interested in is not so much the re-enchantment of the world as the undisenchantment of ourselves.
Yes.
Now, the poet who I think not only wrote about this, you know, via his poetry, but actually wrote about it in prose and really reflected on the whole thing is, you won't be surprised to hear, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Now, when I was doing English, even at so good a place as Cambridge, but certainly, you know, I was doing it in the sixth form, things like, there was a sort of overall narrative about the history of English literature as it related to the progress of you know, science, and the general narrative was this, that eventually, you know, in the 18th and early 19th century, we woke up to the fact that actually the world is a self-sustaining, self-regulating mechanism, that Newton's laws of motion make the great analogy of the world as a piece of clockwork, and whoever made it, is not involved with it now, and it's just winding down, and if there is a clockmaker or a watchmaker, he's now retired to an infinite distance and is kind of paring his fingernails while the thing winds down, which is deism essentially. But deism doesn't, you can drop the deist bit, you can just be an atheist and run it like that. Now, the narrative about the history of English literature we got was, once you had the great crises of faith in the 18th and 19th century, everybody, as it were, agreed that the world was in fact just as dull as we are, and is just a clump of unanimated and unmysterious stuff, whose secrets, not mysteries but secrets, we will unlock, largely with a view to manipulating it for the sake of power. That was, that was the narrative. So we were then told the Romantic movement arose in reaction to that, but the narrative was that people couldn't, people couldn't face the grimness, the actual grimness of reality. So they were keen on poets and painters who could just go within and, give us lots of lovely private individual aesthetic subjective experiences and little aesthetic thrills and senses of the sublime. But actually this was a kind of compensation, a kind of hanging gallery of nice pretty pictures in the interior of our mind to compensate for the grimness of what's out there, the increasing grimness. And
I suppose they were advertising was as an exception to the rule, I suppose.
Well, they that was the narrative. So when I actually read those poets, not the secondary works about them, but particularly when I read Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, I noticed that Coleridge was not saying, we are going to provide you with a sweet comfort, which is purely subjective, as has no purchase on objective truth. This is what, but it'll pass the time of day before we all expire, and then the universe expires, and the second law of thermodynamics. He didn't say that. So when he asked what he and, in the biography, what he and Wordsworth thought they were up to when they wrote the lyrical ballads, he says what he was trying to do, and this is his exact words, is to awaken the mind's attention. Not to lull the mind with kind of opiate fantasies, but to awaken the mind's attention. And then here comes the key thing. He says, to remove the film of familiarity which our selfishness and solicitude has cast over the world. Now, selfishness is one thing. Solicitude is a very interesting word, because if you solicit something, you want something. And he thought we had created this gauze, this film of familiarity, largely so that we could then see the world as dead enough to exploit. And he thought that this was in fact a false view. And it was a false view because reason is not the only instrument whereby we get to know what is the case. He thought the imagination was one of the prime aspects of the perception, that all perception involved imagination as well. And so he thought poetry was as much an instrument for finding out what's really there as the polished lens of a telescope is, So that he makes a case for poetry as a way of knowing. Now, I took that up and ran with it, and my academic work has been very much a defense of the imagination as at least potentially a truth-bearing faculty. And I think there are truths about the world, including its enchanted nature, to which only the imagination gives us access. Now, probably the single thing I got most from Coleridge was a challenge to the clockwork model, the mechanistic model, what Coleridge called this hideous watchmaking scheme of things. And basically he said, what if, that's just one model. What if the world is more like an utterance or a poem than it is like a piece of clockwork? You can take a clock to pieces and put it back together again, but what if all the phenomena of the world are saying something? They are themselves. But so famously in Frost at Midnight, he says, about his child, how he wants him to grow up, and he wants Hartley to grow up, thou, my child, shall wander like a breeze by lakes and sandy shores, beneath the crags of ancient mountains. And then he says, so shalt thou see and hear. He doesn't say, so shalt thou see and hear certain geological and meteorological phenomena. What he says is, so shalt thou see and hear the lovely shapes and sounds intelligible of that eternal language which thy God utters, who doth teach himself in all and all things in himself, great universal teacher, he shall mould thy spirit, and by giving make it ask. It's as though Coleridge says, like if I gave you a poem, right? Or, you have this book, let's say. You didn't know that this was a series of incantations and chants intended to lift the veil, and you just thought it was a physical object. You could spend a couple of years, you could weigh it, you could measure it, you could do a chemical analysis of the paper and probably work out which trees were pulped to make it. You could analyze the ink, you could do geometry of the letters, you could do you could do 2 years worth of impeccable empirical scientific research and never know that it was a poem. But if I then walked into your room one day and picked it up and started reading it to you, you go, blimey, I had no idea it meant anything. And well, none of that would in the least invalidate any of the important things you discovered about heights and depths and weights and measures. Do you know what I mean? And in fact, your statistical study of the frequency and recurrence of certain letters might even help you to appreciate the poem. Now you know it's a poem. So I think Coleridge was saying the world is like that. It is analyzable at one level, but it has to be read or heard. It has to be allowed to chant at another one.
It's so fascinating because this speaks perfectly to I've referenced already on this show a recent podcast I've started called Uncommon Ground, and our first episode featured Richard Dawkins opposite Rowan Williams, and
very good. Yeah.
and we were talking specifically about the poetry of reality. And it was so fascinating because Dawkins was very open about the fact that he gets very moved when he reads great works of poetry, Yeats being a particular love, one of his favorites. And he says, but I can't really explain why I often am brought to tears by what I'm read. Now, as the conversation progressed, he said, I just have to assume it is just something, it's the neurons, it's the synapses firing. It's, that, and even, so it's fascinating that someone can kind of come to the edge of reading the world differently, but still retreat back to a sort of
and
a one-dimensional view of it.
I was at a Greenbelt festival once where he was being interviewed, and somebody said to him, the interviewer said to him, Professor Dawkins, what is the meaning of life? And he said, without blinking, he said, the replication of our DNA and RNA. And the follow-up question was, do you want any music at your funeral? And he said, suddenly Liz Isley said, yes, Bach's B minor mass. It's kind of, you felt like saying, well, go figure, as the Americans say. But going back to this thing about disenchantment, re-enchantment, what I'm saying, therefore, is that part of the inside the word enchantment is the word chant. And in a sense, we have to hear, as old Mahler said, Das Lieder von der Erde, the songs of the earth. We have to hear the chant again. We have to tune our ears to it. And that's part of what we do. But we have to chant in our turn. We have to make and shape the beautiful response to the beauty that we see. And that is part of reality. That's as much part of reality. So as the things we analyze, and dissolve chemically. Now, Wordsworth famously said we murder to dissect, but we don't have to murder. We can learn more about a creature thriving in its natural habitat than we can about it on a block. So there is a way of seeing the world, which I think is not contrary to science, but complementary to it. So Lewis is so good at distilling things with absolutely simple clarity. So in one of Lewis's late essays about the relation between reason and imagination, he says, reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination is the organ of meaning.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. We must talk about your wonderful Galahad and the Grail, the first volume of Merlin's Isle. This is an epic poem, essentially, and so epic that you're still in the process of writing it, obviously. Where did this all begin for you, though? You've talked about the fact that you live in conversation with many poets and authors from previous centuries. Has this tale kind of been part of your background as well?
Yeah,
Malcolm?
absolutely. And it goes back almost to my pre-literate self, my child still puzzling out his letters, because my mother from whom all the poetry side of me kind of flows down from my mother and my grandmother. My grandmother was a published poet in Glasgow, published 2 fine volumes of poetry. But my mother was absolutely full of poetry. She recited The Ancient Mariner to me when I was a kid, all that kind of thing. But she used to tell me the Arthur stories, and she told them to me very beautifully. And she didn't hold back. She, it was quite harrowing stuff she told me. I mean, so I learned to love them as a child. And then gradually, I think I got, probably when I was 9 or 10, I got the Roger Lancelin Green retelling of the Arthur stories. And then when I went up to Cambridge, because I wanted to do more medieval, and I read Mallory, and it really began to reach inside to me. So I've had a love of these stories for a long time, and I actually conceived the idea of trying to write some Arthurian poetry in my late teens. I had a go at writing some stuff in Spenserian stanzas, and this was in my full kind of slushy sub-Keatsian. I was just a Keats wannabe. I would, I was like, when I mouthed Keats out in my mind, I was kind of like the kid at the back of an Eric Clapton concert playing air guitar. It's like, how do I sound like that? So I those first efforts weren't very good, and they were sort of pastiche Keats and Spenser, and they were full of quoths and doths and prithys, and anyway, so I had to learn how to do poetry a different way. But then I was puzzled about how to approach it. I was daunted. Obviously, I had Tennyson's example, and Tennyson chose blank verse. But his first Arthurian goes are much more beautifully ringing and singing. The Lady of Shalott, everybody loves and sort of knows. But he thought, I have a grand task and a grand subject, and he does the blank verse. But the problem with that is that if you're in any way deeply imbued with the English poetic tradition, then after Milton, it's almost impossible to write a blank verse epic without it becoming sub-Miltonic. I mean, and therefore, because you're not Milton, it becomes kind of ponderous and over heavy, and takes itself too seriously, or I don't know, various difficulties around it. So I thought, I can't do that. I had the example of Charles Williams writing in a kind of modernist style a cycle of lyrics which don't tell you the story, but they assume you know the whole story, and then they zoom in on one bit or another. Obviously, the example of T.H. White, fabulous prose writer, but I read Sword in the Stone when I was a kid and loved it, but when I came back to it as an adult, I found all the layers of irony and the deliberate anachronisms, and the sense of that there's a slight tone of mockery, and there's a bit of a wink going on from T.H. White to the adult reader who's reading it. The fact that he talks about questing with a no-G, as though he's obviously having a go at the squirearchy of his days, hunting, shooting and fishing, and do you know what I mean? He's got too much, so I found that unsatisfactory. There was David Jones, but David Jones, David Jones, one of the 4 great high modernists, but the Arthurian material emerges in both in parenthesis anathemata, and even more explicitly the Sleeping Lord. But frankly, it expects vast learning. It's written in about 5 languages. It's full of bits of Welsh and untranslated Greek. It's bristling with footnotes, and it's kind of post Joycean. I thought, I can't go there. And I also wanted, because I'd been enchanted as a child, I wanted to write a poem that would be accessible to fairly young people, but would give a lot of growth and resonance, would have lots of headroom and heart room for people growing up. And I was just, I don't know how to do this. And of course, meantime, with the other part of my mind, I was writing this extended study of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the book that became Mariner, A Voyage with Samuel, in which I was pointing out how Coleridge had taken the ballad form, which is a common, unliterary, street corner, folk tale, pre-literate form, which eventually finds its way into print in the 16th and 17th, 18th century. And he uses that form, but he remakes it. He turns it into this incredibly subtle instrument which can achieve all kinds of delicate effects. And he does that sometimes by keeping to the 4-line thing, but sometimes expanding, and having little things. And I just suddenly thought, that is the way forward. I'm going to do it in ballad form. and I'm going to put the chant into it. I'm going
Mm.
to hope that the poetry has an incantatory effect, and that it therefore opens up parts of your heart and mind and sensorium which aren't engaged by prose, because in a sense
Mm.
you're too busy parsing the prose, whereas the poetry kind of sweeps you along. That was the aim. Now I
Oh.
realized I was going right out on the end of a literary limb here. I mean, nobody's done this nobody's done it at this scale, certainly since Tennyson. So we're talking about um, you know 150 years or more. Um, And so I remember saying, I was trying to get it to various publishers, they all want you to have a USP, a unique selling point. You say, well, the unique selling point is that no one's done it for 150 years. But that might also be the other USP. It might be the unique sinking point. Because there must be a reason why.
Yeah.
And that's partly why I kind of tried it out. I had various friends who had teenage kids trying it, and I put bits of it on my Spell in the Library YouTube, and I got such a strong feedback of, yeah, go for it.
Mm.
But I do hope that people who have the book will read it aloud. And in fact, I've just finished recording the entire thing for an
Oh, wow.
audiobook.
Yeah,
So
wonderful.
Oh,
some people might even enjoy having the book open in front of them because
yeah. That would be like a warm bath, wouldn't it, for your ears? Let me encourage you, Malcolm, because in the note, there's a note from the poet at the beginning of the book, and you say, like, why don't you try that? This is actually written to be chanted, to be spoken, to be sung. Why don't you have a go? And so I was like, okay, I'll have a go. And it's just ballad poetry is so interesting because what it does, and this is kind of a half-baked thought in my head, so bear with me, but you start reading it and it feels a little bit like you're like beginning to play an instrument you've never picked up before.
Yeah.
And within 2-3 pages you're like, how can I play this instrument? Like, honestly, like the words and the rhythm, it just carries you along, and all of a sudden you think, oh my goodness, I'm playing this is happening.
Yeah. Oh,
How
good.
is
Well,
this?
that's exactly what I wanted to happen
Yeah.
about. So I'm very pleased to put that
You're
in.
like, oh my goodness, I'm staying upright and we're moving and we're
And
doing
you,
this.
it's like riding a horse. The verse would surge you forward, as Susanna Clark kindly said in the foreword. She was gracious enough to have done. That you're kind of carried forward like the knights on their horses by the sort of speed of the verse.
That's exactly it. And so, because of that, because you're kind of like your brain is sort of doing this thing almost subconsciously because it's carried by those horses, your words, it allowed me to focus on details of the story. And I suppose it made me realize that anything I knew about this story was very 2D, very flat, quite hollowed out. And I certainly thought that it was a quote unquote like Celtic story, a pre-Christian story, let's say. And then I was reading your retelling, reimagining of it. And I was like, well, I don't know if this is my sort of bias looking for these things, but there's so much biblical imagery. And so I was just wondering, and this is really going to sort of shame me because it's like undeniable ignorance on my part, but is that something that you've specifically drawn out, or is sort of like the Christian story always mysteriously been there, kind of hidden in plain sight?
Yes. Well, thank you all for asking that question, Belle, because it goes right to the heart of one of my whole reasons for writing it.
Great.
Is that when both my mother's stories had kept what way of telling had kept the Christian things, but they're not necessarily made explicit, but for you, if you have ears to hear and eyes to see, they're there. So then when I came and read, essentially Mallory is a translation and gathering of lots of Anglo-Norman and French and Latin sources all kind of jumbled together, which is why it has various references. I mean, just to take a blindingly obvious thing, it's really clear that everything about Galahad is to do with Pentecost. He arrives at Pentecost, he wears red armor, there's a sound of a mighty rushing wind, like tongues of flame. Clearly there is a Pentecostal vibe. But here's the interesting thing, and it's just like Gawain in the Green Knight. You couldn't get more, rooty and pagany and everything with a wonderful Green Knight. But the whole thing happens at Christmas. And this the miracle of the sword and the stone, it happens in the middle of in the Mallory's while mass is being said, as it were. A miracle happens outside the church as well as inside the church, and the sword and the stone appears. Now the point there is the outside and inside. What actually I think is really going on in these stories is that people who are deeply soaked in the gospel and have understood it, and particularly understood it sacramentally. A lot of the best retellings, Chrétien de Troyes and Geoffrey of Monmouth, Robert de Boron, all those sources which Mallory draws on, the Vulgate cycle as it's called, those are written in the 12th century, a lot of them, 12th, at a time when the church was really, really developing a very powerful and what you might call a high theology of the sacrament. And the stories are clearly influenced by it. However, this is the really significant thing. If you had been, a devout Christian in the 12th century, and you'd gone, say, to the local Cistercian monastery or the local church or cathedral, as you would on a Sunday, to Mass, you would have been in the nave. There would have been this rood screen, beautifully carved, sometimes with all kinds of foliate heads and all sorts of things. And you would never be allowed beyond the rood screen as a layperson. You would never get into the choir, let alone the sanctuary. And then at the sanctuary is the high altar. And you would hear a bell rung. You would smell the incense coming through. You would see, glimpsed partially through the kind of, carved foliage of the rood screen, you would see the chalice raised. You would hear the words of consecration, hoc est corpus meum, this is my body. And if you didn't understand it, and you didn't really know what was going on, that would degenerate, as it did in folk parlance, into hocus pocus. That's where it is. But no, if you got it, it was hoc est corpus. This is my body. This is my blood, right? Now, what would have happened to you is, after that high mystery, at which everybody would have been silent, you would have crossed yourself, while the priests were actually sharing the chalice, you would have queued up to the little wicket gate in the rood screen, where you would have been handed a blessed wafer. You would have communion in one kind, not in two kinds. So the chalice and were only for the priests. Now, you can imagine you would find that very attractive, but also inaccessible. Now, the fundamental thing that the Arthurian romances, and particularly the Grail romances, does is it's a supposal. It's an imagination. Somebody's thinking, what would happen if Jesus himself, in the bread and the wine, in the chalice, decided to bust out of this sacred enclosure? What would happen if the holy chalice, in its full transubstantiated, awesome presence, suddenly appeared in the court of a secular king like King Arthur in Camelot? How would that work? What would that draw to light in people? What would it repel them? Would even the greatest of knights, Lancelot, ever be able to come close to it? If not, who could? All these questions, So it's saying, let's imagine it somewhere else. So there's that. But the other thing that's going on, I think, is that Christianity has been in the islands long enough now to begin to, as it were, bring to a fruitful conclusion the conversation with the pagan stories, the Celtic pre-Christian stories. So there were stories about magical vessels and cauldrons in the Celtic thing. There was a cauldron of generation, where if it was there and you had this magic cauldron, you could take as much as you liked from it, and everybody could be filled with the things they like best to eat. And that's exactly what happens when the Grail appears at Camelot for the first time. There was a spear. There was the spear of Bronn. But now, I don't think the Christian approach was to say, we're going to totally trash and erase all your old stories, and we'll have a tabula rasa, and anything that ever happened before a Christian missionary arrived is a thing of darkness. No, that was not the approach. And we know that specifically from Bede's History of the English Church and People, and from the letters that were written about you must let people continue to worship in the place they used to worship, So instead, it says, well, maybe your story was up to something there, because in truth, the time would come when there would be a sacred vessel. And in that sacred vessel, God would give the whole of himself to the whole of you. And that vessel would not only be about death, but also about life. And it would be about the resurrection. And that's what the cauldron was always about. And there is a spear which is sacred and which, misused, can lead to destruction. But the spear of Bronn was the beginning of that story, but it finds its deepest meaning in the spear of Longinus that pierced Christ's heart. So, and it is true that when the king is wounded, the land is wounded. That ancient theme of the dolorous stroke and the wasteland, probably
Yes.
Christian. The analysis of it, which influenced T.S. Eliot and influenced a lot of people, is Jessie Weston's book From Ritual to Romance, in which she sees all of that, the spear and the cup and the wounding of the king and the healing of the king and the wasteland, as going back to some pre-Christian sort of vegetative religious myth of enacting the death of the ground in winter and the birth of it in spring. And again, now all of that is true, but the question is this: what the particularly the both secularist and then neo-pagan handlers of this story wanted to do was to say, actually, it's really pagan. It's just been given a light Christian gloss, and we'll take that off and re-paganizing it.
Okay.
But actually, this is simply not the case. If you read the actual texts, they couldn't be more Christian. And if you look for the pagan texts, they've all been written down and remembered by Christians. So there was some way. So for me, the biblical paradigm of all of this is Paul on Mars Hill. When we're told when he arrived in Athens, he was disgusted, as he would be as a pious Jew by all statues. But some wonderful work of the Spirit is done in him, because by the time he gets to Mars Hill, he doesn't say, "Men of Athens, you utterly disgust me with your filthy paganism. We're going to have a clean sweep here." What he actually says, men of Athens, I see in all ways you're very religious. As I observed the objects of your worship, I saw this statue to an unknown God. He whom you worship is unknown, them therefore I preach. And I think that was the approach. So, but I found in modern retellings, either the mystery was entirely erased or it was repaganized. But here's the interesting thing. I wanted to say, okay, the pagan stuff finds its fruition in Christ. Bring it all in. I'm not trying to, I'm not going to miss anything. But now, at the time I was writing this and doing bits of it on my blog, on my YouTube, I literally thought to myself, boy, am I going to be in trouble with Martin Shaw? Because
you do not want to be in trouble with Martin Shaw.
I saw it as the best neo-pagan in the business in terms of how to tell these stories. And I admire his storytelling skills. But and then amazingly, I got an email from Martin. I thought, oh boy, and the email was, keep going. I like what you're doing. And then he'd come and see me. And of course, I went to see him, and it was just on the cusp of what turning out to be his return to faith, but a return to faith which deepens everything. And he brings the white heart and the mossy-faced Christ and all of that in with him, which is exactly what I'm trying to do in these stories. So he and I have become real kindred souls.
What a duo. Gosh.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, this episode of this current season is perhaps the closest related to our previous season, where we spoke to Martin about his own story and his wonderful new book, Liturgies of the Wild. But just sticking for a moment with the sort of those who occupy that interesting ground between the pagan and the Christian and so on. So I've got a 10-year-old son, Toby, and he's grown up on Narnia. I've read that to him over the years, and he's currently going through his Harry Potter phase. He's ripped through all of the books.
Good.
He's on the final one. But he just said to me the other day, and he may have even seen me looking at your book. He said, "Was Merlin a real person, Dad? Because he pops up in a few places in Harry Potter, and he started to watch the sort of TV dramatization of Merlin." And I said, "Oh, well, funnily enough, I'm just reading a big poem called Merlin's Isle at the moment." Now, Merlin, isn't front and center in this particular volume.
No, he will be in the next volume.
Right. Well, I was going to say, I suspected he was going to get his own.
It's the prequel, as it were. It's the prequel where... No, Merlin has already sort of departed by the time this one begins.
I just wanted to get, though, for the sake of my son Toby as much as anything, how do you view Merlin as this sort of interesting character who obviously, at some level is clearly has pagan origins, but is also, in the same way, I suppose that in Lord of the Rings, Gandalf kind of represents a sort of Christ-like character. What's going on?
Yeah, well, Merlin, I think, is a really, really important figure, precisely because he himself embodies the meeting of the pre-Christian and the Christian.
Yeah.
First thing to say is Merlin is an archetype. He's one of the great archetypes, the magus, the wise man, the wizard. That is a figure almost all cultures have, actually. And Merlin, as you encounter him in the medieval text, clearly has some kind of druidic roots. The actual backstory of Merlin, of course, is that he has a human mother but not a human father, and then the jury is out on, some people want to, where people who are more worried about Merlin and magic say, oh, his father was a devil. People who are less worried about it say, oh, no, he was one of the Longavi, one of the spirits of the air, whatever. But so he's both human and more than human. He's a prophet. The first thing you get about Merlin, I mean, the person who gives us Merlin's name, as opposed to various possible other names, is Geoffrey of Monmouth in 1135, in the history of the kings of Britain. And he no sooner introduces Merlin than he does a whole book of Merlin's prophecies. So Merlin is a prophet. I think in terms of knowing what that archetype is, I think Tolkien has given it so brilliantly in Gandalf that actually, so I'm just writing the appendices to volume 2 at the moment, and I've got a whole essay on Merlin. And I'm saying, in a sense, you now can't write about Merlin without Gandalf being there, in some sense. I mean, I'm happy to acknowledge that. I mean, I think that's... to answer your Toby's question, the question about the historical Merlin is similar to the question about the historical Arthur. I think there is something in history to which both Arthur and Merlin correspond. Actually, the British thought that Merlin was a real person right up until the 16th century. I mean, and in some ways beyond, because there was quite a lot of magical practice in the 16th century, a kind of high Renaissance magia. For me, the most important thing is that Merlin is the keeper and conserver of everything that went before, and he gives, in my version, you'll see this more in volume 2, he mentors Arthur. So Arthur is fully cognizant of all the other stuff, but he's also baptized and is a Christian. And in Malory, there's a conversation, amazingly, between Merlin and the Archbishop of Canterbury, which is, of course, anachronistic. But in Malory, they agree together that on the one hand, the Christmas Mass was important, but on the other hand, the appearance of the sword in the stone, and that this will bring the Christian king, and that Merlin will nurture him. So the historical figure for me, who's most like Merlin, is actually St. Columb, because he was, and who's my patron saint. Column means disciple of Column. Column was... he was one of the last of the Irish bards, so he had the full initiatory Irish bardic training, which meant that he had the whole backstory of Ireland and the ancestors and the She and everything inside him. But then he did that training while he was still a monk, so he had a fully Christian and a fully bardic formation. And I think that's what Merlin is.
I shall relay that to Toby as best I can.
Yeah.
Well, tell him when you get volume 2, he'll get lots of Merlin.
Okay,
Lots
good.
of Merlin. Listening to you talk, I'm reminded of something that I've been speaking about with colleagues a lot, which is, when Jesus he's walking with his disciples and he, points at the rock and he says, if you stay silent, these rocks will cry out. So I'm just so struck by the curiosity. We seem to have lost our curiosity to try and spot rocks that might have been crying out.
Yeah, rocks might cry out. And they might, I mean, there's a big, again, in volume 2, there's quite a lot about standing stones and speaking. But sorry, I can't forbear to tell you a little story. So one of the possible places where Merlin might be and ready to emerge, when Arthur returns, is Inighenley, the Bardsey Island off the end of the Clean Peninsula. And I was once there on a retreat in the 80s when you could still get across to it. And there was a hermitess living on the island at that time. And because we'd brought a priest with us, she was going to come. And there are the ruins of the old Christian French. She was going to come and so she could receive communion. But she was in silence. We'd all been told strictly never to go within 50 yards of her, she did. So we all gathered and we had a Sunday morning Eucharist, it was an Anglican. And the guy that was preaching... that text happened to be exactly that text about if the children didn't praise, these stones would cry out.
Yeah.
And the guy was preaching one of these rather dull demythologizing type of sermons where he said, well, of course, this is a figure of speech, and but there is a sense, is there not, in which these stones do call out, meaning the ruins of the sea. These stones speak to us, in their ruination. And he was just in the middle of it, going to that, when the hermitess, who'd said nothing, for the whole way, stopped him in his tracks and said, but these stones do cry out, I've heard them.
Wow.
And then she didn't say, I thought, good on you.
Yes.
I'll never forget that.
Oh, yeah. That's
She
so
may hear
great.
more than we do, you know. So
Yeah, absolutely. We're
that was in a Merlin-y place as well.
a
So
Merlin-y play. We are spilling over time, but I just want to say as well that to anyone who buys Galahad and the Grail, the prelude has been such a gift. In particular, it's like this manifesto for
it is,
anyone.
yeah.
Yeah, it's like the
It's amused
manifest.
giving me my marching orders. You know, I've been
Yes.
putting it off for decades. Now you've got to do it, guys.
Exactly. It was your marching orders to create this work, but also it's marching orders for anyone to create the work that they are too scared to do, but the work that is theirs to do. And it's just the most gorgeous thing. And I just love to read the final stanza as kind of a way to. Actually, Malcolm, would you like to read the final few lines as a way to sort of round this off for us?
I'll happily do that. Yeah.
It's just the most beautiful opening to a book. You kind of have to pause there.
Well, why don't I just read the last three stanzas?
Perfect. Let's do that.
So, I'm being told to listen before I write the poem. Yea, listen well before you start. Be still ere you begin. See through the surface round about, the noise, the rush, the fear, the doubt. Though modern Britain lies without, fair Logres lives within. You may yet walk through Merlin's isle, by oak and ash and thorn. The ancient hills, do not forget, and you might wake their wisdom yet. Who knows what wonders might be met on this midsummer morn? So I have taken up the tale, to tell it full and free, the tale that makes my heart rejoice. I tell it, for I have no choice. I tell it, till another voice takes up the tale from me.
Oh, thank you. Malcolm, I feel like I need 20 minutes in an ice cream freezer after this conversation to let it all soak in. Thank you so much for joining us on Re-Enchanting.
Okay, it was a pleasure. Good.
Bless you, Malcolm. Thank you. We'll make sure there's links, of course, to Galahad and the Grail from today's show. Do go and check it out.
Yeah, so for England, the Canterbury Press site, and for America, the Rabbit Room.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. What a treat, Belle. What a treat it's been having Malcolm on today. Thank you.
A delight.
So thank you very much for listening, for watching. Don't forget, you can find more from Re-Enchanting over at seenandunseen.com. And if you'd like to support the work we're doing there, do feel free to click on the support link, and you can help us make more of these Re-Enchanting podcasts too. But from myself, from Malcolm, and from Belle, we'll say goodbye, thank you, and see you next time.